Amelia Catherine believed her jet needed nothing more than her word to leave the ground, until Mason Carter, the quiet single father everyone dismissed, found the pressurization system tampered with before a classified military flight. In front of the executive team, she delivered her cold warning without any hesitation. Touch her jet again and he would be finished. Minutes later, a call from the Pentagon froze the entire hangar into silence. Mason was not permitted to leave the building, because he was the one person the government had trusted with this aircraft long before Amelia Catherine ever knew his name. Stay until the very end, because this final landing will expose the true traitor hiding in plain sight all along. Rain hammered the metal roof of a private hangar near a military airbase in Virginia. The kind of downpour that turned every reflection on the tarmac into a smear of white light inside. A silver-white jet belonging to Aerovance Systems sat under floodlights, surrounded by technicians moving with the tight, controlled urgency of people who knew a deadline was closing in fast. This was not an ordinary corporate departure. The aircraft had been quietly fitted to carry emergency communications equipment for the Pentagon, a contract that had taken Aerovance Systems 2 years to secure and that could just as easily be taken away. Amelia Catherine arrived a few minutes before midnight, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place among the grease and cables of the hangar floor. She moved through the space the way she moved through boardrooms, with a posture that dared anyone to slow her down, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete in a rhythm that seemed to announce her arrival, before she had even spoken a word. The board was watching this flight. The press was watching this flight. Somewhere in the Pentagon, officers she had never met were watching this flight as well, and she understood that her company's future rested on getting the jet into the air before dawn. Joseph Hunter stayed close at her side, his tablet glowing with schedules and checklists. He was the operations director, a man who had helped her hold the company together through a brutal financial year, and he kept repeating the same message to anyone who would listen. The aircraft needed to leave on time, no delays, no excuses. The technical crew nodded along, even as some of them exchanged uneasy glances behind his back, because the pre-flight inspection had not actually been completed, and everyone in that hangar understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly how dangerous that gap could become once the aircraft actually left the ground. Near the rear of the hangar, away from the noise, a contract technician named Mason Carter worked without drawing attention to himself. He wore a faded jacket and carried a toolkit that had clearly seen years of use, and most of the younger staff barely registered his presence. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and he never volunteered stories about his past. What no one in that hangar knew was that Mason had once helped design a classified safety protocol used on aircraft carrying sensitive military cargo, a chapter of his life that had been sealed away long before he ever wore an Aerovance uniform. Mason was also a single father, though nothing about the hangar that night revealed it. A brief message flashed across his phone reminding him of a school event the following morning, and he silenced it without a second glance, tucking the phone back into his pocket and returning his full attention to the aircraft in front of him. His daughter was the quiet center of his life, the reason he took jobs like this one instead of chasing recognition, but he never let that part of himself surface at work. Lucas Wyatt, the technical team lead, warned Mason under his breath not to make waves that night. The company was under too much pressure, he said, and nobody wanted a contract technician causing delays. Mason said nothing in response. He simply kept his eyes on the secondary pressurization readout, where a number sat just slightly out of place, a discrepancy small enough for most people to overlook and large enough, to someone who understood the system, to matter enormously. As he traced the anomaly further, Mason recognized something troubling in the secure communications relay tied to the military portion of the flight. If the jet lifted off with this fault intact, the danger would not stay confined to a minor technical failure. At high altitude, under classified operating conditions, a fault like this could cascade into something far worse. Mason closed the panel gently, thought for a long moment, and decided that whatever came next, he was not going to stay silent. The hangar widened into a cavern of noise and light as the deadline drew closer, rain still drumming overhead, white floodlights bouncing off the polished body of the jet while the technical crew moved in tight, hurried circles around it. Carts loaded with cable spools rolled past open panels, and somewhere near the tail section a ladder scraped against the floor as a technician climbed to check an antenna housing for the third time that night, the whole space thrumming with the particular anxiety of people who understood exactly how much was riding on the next few hours. Amelia Catherine stood near the nose of the aircraft and addressed the staff directly, her voice carrying easily over the din, informing everyone that the jet needed to leave the ground before 5 in the morning without exception. There was no room in her tone for negotiation, only the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Joseph Hunter reinforced her message a moment later, reminding the crew that the contract attached to this flight was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that any delay risked Aerovance Systems losing its place in a defense program the company had fought years to enter. His words landed hard on the younger technicians, several of whom had families depending on their paychecks and no desire to be blamed for slowing things down. The pressure in the room thickened with every passing minute, and even the most experienced members of the crew found themselves rushing through checklists they would ordinarily have taken far more time to complete, each of them privately hoping that someone else would catch any mistake before it became their own. Mason Carter worked quietly beneath a secondary panel most senior engineers tended to overlook, trusting instead in paperwork that claimed the system had already been verified. Lucas Wyatt crouched beside him and murmured that everything had already been signed off, that there was no need to double-check anything at this stage. Mason did not argue. He simply asked who had provided the final confirmation. Lucas hesitated, then said only that the order had come from above, without offering a name. That answer did not sit right with Mason. He traced the maintenance log further and found a sequence of timestamps that did not align with the actual condition of the aircraft, as though someone had gone back afterward and smoothed over the record. Digging deeper, he discovered that the secondary pressurization system had been deliberately adjusted, and that the discrepancy had been buried beneath a maintenance entry that had clearly been cleaned up after the fact. This was not an oversight. It had the shape of something done on purpose. Mason requested that the fueling process be paused so a more thorough inspection could take place. The announcement rippled through the crew like a current, because everyone understood that halting the process this close to departure could bring serious consequences down on whoever caused the delay. Joseph Hunter noticed Mason standing near the control panel and felt his patience snap almost immediately, storming over with the kind of anger that came easily to a man used to controlling every outcome around him. Word reached Amelia within minutes that a contract technician was holding up her flight. She did not wait for a full explanation. She crossed the hangar floor with quick, deliberate steps, her expression cold enough to silence the crew before she even spoke, and she demanded to know who had given this man permission to touch her aircraft in the first place. The rain outside seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, as though the whole building was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next between the woman who ran the company and the quiet man who refused to look away from what he had found. Mason kept his voice level as he explained to Amelia that the aircraft was not safe to fly, choosing his words carefully even as her stare bore into him with open disbelief. Around them, the rest of the crew slowed their work without quite meaning to, drawn toward the exchange the way people are always drawn toward a confrontation they know they should stay out of, their tools going quiet in their hands as they listened. She assumed he was exaggerating a minor issue to make himself look important in front of the crew, a suspicion that showed plainly on her face as she crossed her arms and waited for him to justify himself. Mason pointed to the secondary pressure readout, the mistimed synchronization in the backup system, and a signal dropout buried inside the military communications relay, laying out each detail without raising his voice. Joseph Hunter cut in before Amelia could respond, insisting that a contract technician had no authority to draw conclusions about a system this sensitive, his tone carrying the particular sharpness of a man who felt his own standing threatened by anyone else's competence. Mason did not react with frustration. Instead, he calmly asked for the original maintenance log rather than the summarized version the crew had been shown. Lucas Wyatt felt a knot form in his stomach, because he already knew that the original log had been quietly replaced by a condensed report that left out several inconvenient details. Evelyn Madison arrived at that moment to review the legal paperwork required before departure, her presence a reminder that this flight carried obligations far beyond the hangar floor. Mason noticed almost immediately that the final approval signature did not match the actual working hours of the technical team, a small inconsistency that suggested someone had signed off on work that had not truly been completed. Amelia, still trusting the man who had stood beside her through years of difficulty, kept her faith fixed on Joseph rather than on the technician trying to warn her, telling herself that loyalty built over years could not simply be set aside because of a stranger's suspicion, even as a small, uncomfortable doubt began to form somewhere beneath her certainty. Mason pressed further, explaining that this fault would not simply destabilize the cabin. It could also lock the wrong communications protocol into place the moment the aircraft entered restricted military airspace, a consequence far more serious than a delayed departure. Joseph seized the opening to paint Mason as unreliable, mentioning that he had once been removed from an earlier program under circumstances nobody in the room understood. Mason offered no defense and no explanation for his past, letting the accusation hang in the air without correcting it. Amelia misread that silence as guilt, convinced that a man with nothing to hide would have spoken up immediately. She ordered Mason to step away from the aircraft without another word of discussion, her patience for the disruption completely exhausted. Mason held her gaze and told her plainly that if she forced him to leave now, she would be sending her entire flight crew into the sky aboard an aircraft that had never actually been confirmed safe. The words landed heavier than he intended, and for a moment nobody in the hangar moved, the tension pressing down on the space like the weight of the storm still beating against the roof. Outside, everyone waiting to see whether Amelia would soften her position or push forward regardless of the warning standing directly in front of her. Even Joseph seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, as though some part of him had not expected Mason to hold his ground this firmly, before he quickly recovered and pressed his case even harder than before. Amelia's patience finally broke as Mason continued standing in front of the technical panel, refusing to move despite the order she had already given him. In that moment she did not see a man with rare expertise or hidden history. She saw a contract worker in a worn jacket, someone who by every visible measure did not belong in a conversation about a flight this important. Joseph Hunter sensed the shift in her mood and pushed harder, telling her that Mason was actively damaging the company's reputation in front of the very people they were trying to impress. The technicians around them fell into an uneasy silence, none of them willing to be pulled into a confrontation that was clearly not theirs to have, several of them suddenly finding urgent reasons to check equipment on the far side of the hangar, rather than remain within earshot of the two people now facing each other down. Mason set his toolkit down slowly, keeping his voice steady even as the room grew tense around him. He told Amelia that he only needed 10 minutes to prove that the fault sat in the secondary pressure line and the verification recorder, nothing more than a short window to demonstrate what he had already found. Amelia answered with a single line that would echo through the hangar long after the words left her mouth. Touch her jet and he was finished. The sentence cut through the noise and left Mason publicly humiliated in front of the entire crew, his warning dismissed as though it had never been spoken at all. Lucas Wyatt lowered his eyes, unable to meet Mason's gaze, ashamed of his own silence even as he told himself there was nothing more he could have done. Evelyn Madison watched Joseph closely during the exchange and noticed something odd in his posture, a flicker of relief that seemed strangely out of place for a man supposedly worried about the company's reputation. Mason did not raise his voice or argue further. He simply looked at the aircraft the way someone looks at a danger that only he seemed to fully understand, a quiet certainty settling over him even as everyone around him assumed the matter was closed. He took half a step back but made no move to actually leave the technical area, his presence still anchored near the panel he had been examining only moments before. Amelia, unwilling to tolerate any further defiance, instructed Samuel Owen to have security escort him out of the building immediately. Before anyone could lay a hand on him, Mason spoke a single sentence that made the entire crew freeze in place. This system was currently running a military protocol, not a civilian one. For a brief instant, something shifted across Joseph's face, a flash of alarm gone almost as quickly as it appeared, though Evelyn caught it and filed the reaction away. Mason quietly triggered a passive alert code embedded in the system years earlier, a failsafe few people even knew still existed. A secondary light on the control panel blinked once and went dark. Nobody in the hangar understood what had just happened, except for the one man standing closest to the aircraft who understood it completely and who now knew with total certainty that whatever came next was no longer a matter he could simply be ordered to walk away from. Amelia demanded that the flight process continue despite everything Mason had just said, brushing his warning aside as though it carried no weight at all. Her jaw set in the same stubborn line it always took whenever she felt her authority being questioned in front of an audience. Moments later, the pilot reported that a strange authentication lock had appeared in the system, one that prevented the startup sequence from completing no matter how many times the crew tried. Joseph immediately pointed a finger at Mason, claiming he had interfered with the system without any authorization to do so, his voice louder now, sharper, edged with something closer to panic than anger. Mason answered calmly that he had not created the lock himself, explaining that it was an automatic response the system generated whenever it detected a mismatch during a flight carrying a military designation. Amelia asked with visible disbelief how a contract technician could possibly know something like that. Mason did not answer right away, bound as he was by an old confidentiality agreement he had signed long before he ever set foot inside this hangar, a silence that only deepened the suspicion already forming around him. Joseph pressed Samuel Owen to remove Mason from the premises at once, insisting it was necessary to protect company assets from further tampering. Evelyn Madison intervened, pointing out that if this aircraft was genuinely connected to a defense contract, the company had no authority to override a safety warning simply because it was inconvenient. Amelia turned her frustration toward Evelyn, accusing everyone around her of stripping away her control over her own company at the worst possible moment. Mason glanced toward the secondary panel and noticed something troubling, data being wiped remotely even as they stood there arguing. He warned the room that someone inside the hangar was actively trying to erase evidence in real time. Lucas Wyatt checked the auxiliary computer and confirmed an administrative login session had just been active moments earlier. Joseph feigned surprise at the discovery, though he quietly sent a message to an unknown contact while pretending to study the readout in front of him. A small movement that Mason happened to catch reflected faintly in the polished metal of the aircraft's fuselage. Mason chose not to accuse him outright, deciding he needed stronger proof before making an open confrontation, aware that a premature accusation could just as easily be turned back around against him if he moved too quickly without enough evidence to support it. Then, without warning, Amelia's secure phone began to ring, the screen displaying a priority contact line reserved for the Pentagon. Amelia froze at the sight of it, her earlier confidence faltering for the first time that night, while Joseph's composure cracked visibly beside her, his eyes darting toward the exits as though searching for a way out that had not yet closed. The hangar seemed to hold its breath around them, rain still pounding the roof overhead, every technician in the room sensing that whatever came through that phone call was about to change everything that had happened so far, and none of them dared to move until Amelia finally lifted the phone to her ear, her hand noticeably less steady than it had been only minutes earlier. Amelia answered the call under the weight of total silence, every technician in the hangar straining to catch whatever fragments of the conversation they could, some of them leaning almost imperceptibly closer without realizing they were doing it. David Logan, speaking from the Pentagon, instructed her to halt all flight operations immediately. His tone leaving no space for negotiation, Amelia tried to hold her ground, reminding him that this was her company's aircraft and that she carried full responsibility for how it was operated. David Logan replied flatly that once a jet carried a military transport designation, priority over its safety protocols belonged to federal authority, not to corporate leadership. He then asked a question that made her stomach drop, wanting to know whether Mason Carter was still present in the hangar. Every head in the room turned toward Mason at once. Amelia felt something close to disbelief settle over her, stunned that the Pentagon knew the name of the very technician she had just humiliated in front of her own staff. Mason stepped forward and took the phone, confirming the current state of the safety lockout in a calm, practiced voice that suggested he had spoken with military officials many times before. David Logan made his position unmistakably clear. Mason was the only person present that night who had ever been cleared to understand the legacy security architecture built into this particular aircraft system. He ordered Amelia to step aside and allow Mason to work without interference, a directive that struck directly at the pride she had carried into the hangar only hours earlier, though something in his tone made it clear the order was not open to debate of any kind. Joseph tried to interject, suggesting that Mason had left an earlier program under circumstances that were far from clear, hoping to plant one more seed of doubt before it was too late. David Logan answered coldly that Mason's actual service record had been sealed for reasons of national security, not because of any wrongdoing on his part. Amelia began to understand in that moment just how badly she had misjudged the man standing quietly beside her, a realization that settled over her slowly and painfully, the way understanding often arrives only after it is already too late to prevent the damage already done. Mason did not gloat and did not seek revenge for the humiliation he had endured only minutes earlier. He simply asked the technical crew to step back from the main system and allow him to examine the verification records without further interruption. Samuel Owen sealed every exit in the hangar according to the federal order now in effect, and every storage device on site was placed under lockdown. Joseph understood, watching the doors close one by one, that the circle around him was tightening with each passing second. Mason stood before the jet now, a man who only an hour earlier had been threatened with termination and was now the sole person authorized to touch the aircraft at all, the rain still falling steadily outside as the balance of power inside that hangar shifted completely, and everyone present understood that nothing about the night would return to how it had started. Mason began his inspection using the old safety procedure he had trained on years earlier, relying less on complicated tools and more on patient logic, tracing login timestamps and watching how the system responded to each command, the same disciplined method he had used long ago on aircraft far more sensitive than this one. Lucas Wyatt helped by pulling a backup copy from the secondary maintenance computer, his hands trembling slightly at first, still afraid of losing his job over what was unfolding. Mason told him quietly that all he needed was the truth, nothing more, and something about the simplicity of that request seemed to steady him. Evelyn Madison cross-referenced the signatures on file and discovered at least 3 confirmations that had been generated after the aircraft was already marked ready for flight, a detail that could not be explained away as simple human error. Amelia watched each piece of evidence surface in front of her, her expression shifting from disbelief to something heavier, something closer to shame. She realized, standing there in the glare of the hangar lights, that the pressure of this contract had led her to dismiss the one voice in the room that had been telling the truth from the very beginning. Mason confirmed that the pressurization fault had not been an accident at all, a conclusion he stated plainly without any hint of satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about proving that someone inside this company had deliberately placed an entire flight crew in danger. Someone had deliberately altered the system so the flight would fail during its most sensitive phase, allowing the failure to be blamed later on ordinary mechanical error. If that plan had succeeded, Aerovance Systems would have lost its defense contract entirely, leaving the company vulnerable to an outside group looking to acquire it at a fraction of its true value. Joseph Hunter's composure finally began to slip, and he insisted that everything Mason was describing amounted to nothing more than speculation, dressed up as fact. David Logan ordered that Joseph remain inside the hangar while the matter was investigated further, and Samuel Owen signaled his security team to seal off every exit. Joseph acted wounded by the accusation, reminding everyone that he had served Amelia loyally for years, his voice rising with an indignation that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Amelia hesitated, caught between the evidence in front of her and her memory of Joseph, helping her keep the company afloat during an earlier financial crisis that had nearly destroyed everything she built, the 2 versions of him refusing to line up neatly inside her mind no matter how hard she tried to reconcile them. Mason did not attack Joseph directly. Instead, he asked one simple question that landed harder than any accusation could have. Why had the cleaned-up record been created from Joseph's own account exactly 7 minutes after the original fault first appeared in the system? The hangar fell completely silent at the question, every technician holding their breath, waiting for an answer that never came. Joseph opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, no explanation forming quickly enough to cover the gap Mason had just exposed in front of everyone watching. Joseph suddenly activated a contingency plan nobody in the hangar had anticipated, and a secondary server tucked away in the technical office began transmitting data outward without authorization, the small green light on its housing blinking rapidly in the dim room as though marking the seconds ticking away. Mason recognized immediately what was happening, that Joseph was attempting to push a fabricated record designed to make it look as though Mason himself had interfered with the aircraft without permission. Samuel Owen and his security team rushed toward the technical office, only to find the door locked from the inside, buying Joseph precious seconds he clearly intended to use. Joseph shouted through the door that Mason was a former technician who had been removed from a fast military program and had returned only to seek revenge against the company that once employed him. Amelia looked at Mason, and for one brief moment, doubt flickered across her face before she pushed it aside. Mason remained composed, telling her quietly that liars usually need a longer story than the truth requires, a simple observation that seemed to settle something in her mind at last. Evelyn Madison discovered that Joseph had secretly signed a consulting agreement with a rival investment group months earlier, a connection that explained everything unfolding in front of them, the pieces of the night finally arranging themselves into a picture far uglier than anyone had initially suspected. His goal had been to sabotage the flight, cause Amelia to lose the defense contract, and watch the value of Aerovance systems collapse under the weight of the failure. Once the company was sufficiently weakened, he intended to step forward as its rescuer, brokering a sale at a price far below what the business was actually worth. Lucas Wyatt admitted, his voice shaking, that Joseph had once pressured him into ignoring a minor warning months earlier, though he swore he never imagined it would lead to something this serious, his shoulders slumping under the weight of a guilt he had clearly been carrying alone for far too long. Amelia absorbed the weight of the betrayal in silence. The pain of realizing it had come from someone she trusted more than almost anyone else in the company. Joseph attempted to flee through a technical corridor at the rear of the hangar, but Samuel Owen blocked his path, only for Joseph to trigger a false alarm that plunged a nearby section into darkness. In the confusion, Mason recalled the layout of the hangar from memory and guided Samuel toward a secondary door that could seal the corridor completely. Joseph was caught just before he could destroy the last piece of physical evidence still in his possession. David Logan ordered that every remaining file and device be collected without delay. Amelia stood before Joseph, no longer shouting, her voice instead carrying a quiet, controlled finality as she announced his immediate suspension in front of the entire staff. Mason turned back toward the jet almost immediately afterward, aware that the larger problem still remained unresolved, because the aircraft itself still needed to be saved before the night could truly be considered over. Even with Joseph restrained and removed from the situation, the aircraft's system remained locked, and unless it was restored correctly, the military flight would be canceled entirely, a failure that would carry serious consequences for Aerovance systems regardless of who was ultimately responsible for the sabotage, since a canceled contract would not distinguish between fault and misfortune once the damage had already been done. Amelia, for the first time all night, lowered her voice and asked Mason what he needed from her. It was a striking reversal, the CEO who had threatened to end his job now placing her trust entirely in his hands. Mason did not make things difficult for her, and he did not bring up the humiliation he had endured earlier that night. He simply assigned clear responsibilities, one after another, moving the group forward with quiet efficiency. Amelia was to contact the board, suspend every commercial pressure surrounding the flight, and formally grant Mason temporary technical authority under the federal directive already in place. Lucas took charge of cross-checking the pressure valves. Evelyn Madison documented every step of the process to protect the company during the investigation that would inevitably follow. Samuel Owen maintained security around the perimeter of the hangar. Mason entered the technical bay and worked through each point Joseph had altered, one careful step at a time, his focus narrowing entirely onto the task in front of him, as though the chaos of the last several hours had simply fallen away the moment his hands returned to familiar work. He discovered that Joseph had done more than change a few numbers. He had also shifted a verification module just enough that the aircraft was refusing to communicate, properly with the military frequency it needed to reach. Amelia watched him work, and something in his manner told her this was not a man trying to prove his own worth. He simply wanted to prevent a tragedy from happening on his watch. She finally asked him why he had never explained his background from the very start of the night. Mason answered that certain things he was never permitted to disclose, but that safety was something he would always protect regardless of the personal cost. Amelia fell quiet, feeling something close to genuine shame for perhaps the first time in years, the sensation unfamiliar enough that she almost did not recognize it at first, accustomed as she was to being the one who assigned blame rather than absorbed it. Outside, the rain grew heavier against the hangar roof, and the clock crept closer to the final deadline they could not afford to miss. Mason called for one last cold system check before any attempt to restore full function, wanting to be certain nothing else had been left compromised. The control panel flickered to life under the harsh white lights, numbers steadying across the display as the crew held their breath around him. Then, without warning, a new alert appeared on the screen, one nobody in the room had anticipated, and for a brief tense moment everyone froze again, wondering whether the night's crisis was truly behind them or whether one final obstacle was still waiting to be uncovered before the aircraft could finally be declared safe. The new alert revealed a hidden secondary lock buried deep inside the authentication sequence. One final obstacle standing between the crew and a completed restoration, a last defense Joseph had apparently built into the system long before that night ever arrived. Joseph, still under guard nearby, let out a bitter laugh and remarked that they would never finish in time. Mason understood instantly that this was the last trap Joseph had left behind, because if the lock was released incorrectly, the system would record Mason himself as the one responsible for sabotaging the aircraft rather than repairing it. Amelia faced a difficult choice in that moment, one that would define whether she had truly learned anything from the night's events. She could continue trusting Mason and allow him to proceed, or she could pull back now to protect the company from further exposure. She thought of the words she had spoken to him only hours earlier, the cold warning that had humiliated him in front of the entire staff. Now, in front of that same staff, she said something very different, declaring plainly that Mason Carter had her full authorization to touch the aircraft. The statement did more than restore his technical access. It returned the dignity that had been stripped from him earlier that night. Mason proceeded with the restoration using the legacy security protocol he had once helped design, moving methodically through each stage of the sequence. Lucas read out the numbers as they appeared. Evelyn recorded every action taken. David Logan monitored the process remotely through the secure military line, ready to confirm the results the moment they were available. The aircraft systems trembled slightly as the live verification sequence began, and a pressure discrepancy appeared at the exact moment the auxiliary engine shifted state. For a heartbeat, everyone in the hangar tensed, fearing the worst, but Mason had already anticipated exactly this possibility. He calmly ordered a secondary branch of the system disconnected and guided the aircraft back into a clean, verified state. One by one, the warning lights along the control panel dimmed and went dark, until the pilot finally confirmed that the aircraft had returned to a fully safe condition. David Logan verified from the Pentagon that the results met every federal requirement, formally clearing the aircraft to proceed, his voice carrying a note of quiet approval that felt, in its own understated way, like the highest praise Mason could have received that night. Joseph sank against the wall behind him, understanding at last that every part of his plan had unraveled completely. Amelia turned to look at Mason, and for the first time that night, she no longer saw a contract technician standing before her. She saw the man who had quietly saved her company from a disaster she had come dangerously close to, allowing a realization that settled over her slowly as the hangar around them began to exhale, the tension of the long night finally starting to loosen its grip on everyone who had lived through it, the storm outside easing into a gentler rain as if the weather itself understood that the crisis had finally passed. Dawn broke slowly after the storm passed, the jet still resting safely inside the hangar, its systems fully restored and cleared for departure under federal supervision rather than the frantic commercial pressure that had driven the night's chaos. The flight was placed under a formal federal review, no longer forced into the air simply to satisfy a business deadline that had nearly caused a disaster. Joseph Hunter was escorted away along with the storage devices and falsified files that had nearly destroyed everything Amelia had spent years building. Lucas Wyatt was protected as a cooperating witness rather than being made a scapegoat for decisions that had never truly been his to make. Evelyn Madison proposed a complete overhaul of the company's approval procedures, determined to ensure that no single individual could quietly manipulate safety records again, without immediate detection. David Logan told Amelia plainly that if Mason had not caught the fault when he did, the consequences could have reached far beyond the loss of a single contract, a truth that settled heavily over her as the morning light spread across the tarmac outside. Amelia stood before Mason once more, and the difference in her bearing was unmistakable compared to the woman who had issued her cold warning only hours earlier. She apologized in front of the entire technical crew, offering no excuses about pressure or deadlines, no attempt to soften what she had done. Mason accepted the apology without triumph or bitterness in his voice. He told her simply that anyone who worked around aircraft needed to learn humility before the truth, because the sky had never once forgiven arrogance, and it never would. Amelia offered him a new position overseeing independent safety review for every flight connected to defense operations going forward. Mason did not accept immediately. He wanted the arrangement built on a clear contract with well-defined responsibility, not on a gesture made in a moment of emotional relief. This quiet insistence revealed something essential about his character, a man who valued transparency over sentiment and had no interest in a reward offered simply to ease someone else's guilt. Amelia agreed to his terms without hesitation, recognizing that this, too, was part of what made him trustworthy. In the final moments of that long night, Mason walked out of the hangar as the rain finally stopped, the air outside carrying the particular stillness that follows a storm, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than simply given. Amelia remained behind, looking at the jet with eyes that no longer saw only a symbol of her authority. It had become, instead, the greatest lesson of her career, a reminder that competence often wears a quiet face and that power without humility eventually meets a truth it cannot outrun. Somewhere beyond the hangar, the sun rose fully over the airfield, carrying with it the sense that justice finally been returned to the person who had earned it, that the man once dismissed for his simple appearance had proven, in the end, to be the only one capable of saving everyone left standing inside that building. If anyone watching this has ever been dismissed because of the way they dressed, the job they held, or the quiet way they carried themselves, let this story serve as a reminder that real value rarely needs to raise its voice. Mason Carter did not win because he shouted louder than Amelia Catherine. He won because he stayed calm, stayed accurate, and refused to abandon the truth even after being humiliated in front of everyone he worked with. Consider this before moving on. Did Amelia truly earn the forgiveness Mason offered her that morning, or did she simply get fortunate that the one man she underestimated happened to be decent enough to give her a second chance? Sometimes the person forced out of the room turns out to be the only one who can save everybody left inside it.